Here the Queen Mary slides into Southampton after another transatlantic run. A royal lady come home once more.
Once upon a time, if you wanted to get anywhere in the world, across the roaring Atlantic midwinter, where the waves stand the height of apartment blocks, or way down to Australia over the Indian Ocean and its blistering sun, you would have to board an ocean liner. These magnificent pieces of technology were the toast of their era, and from the 1800s, when they were first introduced, until the mid-20th century they evolved and grew to gargantuan proportions. They served their respective countries heroically in wartime. They transported celebrities and migrants alike in their hundreds of thousands, and they cut the journey across the Atlantic from weeks and weeks to just 3.5 days. Then, they disappeared. Quietly in the background, a technological war had been waged. For half a century, the airplane had grown and evolved too, and then, when the ocean liner was right at its absolute height, the unthinkable happened. Almost overnight, the world's great ocean liners were made redundant. Passenger bookings dropped to nothing. Once celebrated ships were pulled unceremoniously from service and sat rusting awaiting their fates. Overhead, the roar of jet engines sang their swan song. Just how this played out, the key players and companies, is one of the most interesting technological tales of our times. It's a sad tale of redundancy, of what happens when the times move on and leave the marvels of the past behind. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how the ocean liner died. The New York Chelsea Piers. Since the turn of the 20th century, this was the gathering place for a veritable who's who of the world's largest and most glamorous passenger ships. From the Cunard darlings Mauretania and Lusitania at Pier 54, to the later magnificent Queen Mary and Elizabeth at Pier 90, the spectacular Normandy of the French line at Pier 88, and the record-breaking SS United States at 86. The ships that frequented these piers were celebrities in their own right, and they helped the piers earn their very apt nickname, beginning in the 1930s, Luxury Liner Row. In the post-Depression era, Luxury Liner Row was home to a near constant flurry of activity, as passengers of all kinds made their way to and from these grandiose vessels, with transatlantic services offered multiple times per week across several fleets of ships. These ships were capable of whisking travellers across the ocean in around 4.5 days, with the Speed Queen, SS United States, offering a trip across the Atlantic in a ripping 3.5. Most passengers look forward to their voyages, which in many ways were like holidays all of their own. Travel by sea had come leaps and bounds since the days of rickety and dangerous packet sailing ships, and in just a few short decades, luxury liners had evolved and transformed, making once dreaded sea travel a stylish and savvy way to cross the Atlantic. The steam engine meant big ships could propel themselves over the world's oceans at previously unthought of speed and regularity. Sailing ships had been doomed to sail only when the weather permitted, but steamships didn't have to worry about that, they could just forge ahead. The humble, fare-paying passenger could look forward to a relatively easy few days at sea, where every need was met, and then some. For the wealthy, it meant travelling in luxury that rivaled their favourite hotels ashore, like the Ritz and the Savoy. For the poor, it meant amenities and comforts few had ever seen before at all, like flushing toilets, electric lights, and 3 square meals a day. It wasn't just a matter of convenience either. Crafting the world's largest and fastest ships was a matter of national pride for their home countries, and celebrities and society's elite were all known to have their preferred ships, their favourite staterooms, and even captains, making a crossing on a luxury liner into a star-studded event. It wasn't just the transatlantic crossings either. Passengers could get all the way from England or America to Australia, New Zealand, or the Far East on a single ship on a single voyage. It'd take weeks, but it would be a comfortable and enjoyable escape, especially for those who weren't seasick. The ocean liner had enjoyed an unrivaled dominance of the world's ocean highways. It hadn't always been smooth sailing though, some tough lessons had to be learned along the way. There had even been attempted interlopers when Zeppelins had briefly offered transocean services, but that had eventually ended in disaster, and it wasn't pursued further. Oceanliners were the undisputed monarchs of the ocean. But then, in 1957, just south of Seattle, Washington, something momentous happened that would change the world forever. To understand this, we need to wind the clock back.
Comes all the scene in my flying machine, going up, she goes, she goes.
Throughout the 1920s, while travel by steamship was just beginning to reach the heights of absolute glitz and glamour, aviation was still well in its infancy. Travellers around the world were becoming more and more curious about air travel, and buzz began to circulate as this seemingly futuristic bit of engineering started to gain widespread notoriety. But much like ocean travel in the 1800s, aviation at the time still left much to be desired. While they had come a long way since the days of the Wright brothers, helped along massively by the huge technological advancements gleaned in the First World War, early passenger airplanes were cramped, cold, noisy, slow, and dangerous. Many aircraft could only seat around 20 passengers at a time, versus the 1,000 or more that could travel at once on board an ocean liner, and the unpressurized and unheated cabins made flying a frigid affair, especially at higher altitudes. Passengers bundled up in hats and coats to combat the freezing air with almost nothing in the way of insulation to fend off the bitter temperatures outside. Frequent refueling stops extended already sluggish flight times. Passenger aircraft were also slow. Most could only muster around 100 miles an hour, still much quicker than a ship, but then they needed to stop every few hundred miles to refuel. During the peak years of the ocean liner, travel by air was still prohibitively expensive too, with some trips costing about half as much as a brand new car. This meant that in its early years, flying remained reserved for only the most wealthy or daring of society, and daring they needed to be. Early aviation's safety record would give any traveller pause for thought. In the late 1920s, the accident rate was 1 aircraft lost for every million miles flown. Now, at the same rate, in today's world, that would equal around 7,000 fatal plane crashes annually. Navigational instruments were simple. Aircraft engines were relatively underpowered. They were completely at the mercy of the sky and its temper, and many simply disappeared. The aircraft showed promise, and the number of passenger flights slowly grew, but they couldn't yet hope to match the comfort and the luxury of the world's beloved palaces at sea. And by the year 1926, only 6,000 souls were brave enough to take to the air in these primitive commercial aircraft. Clearly, there was much progress left to be made if travel by air could ever hope to rival travel by sea. And the ocean liner enjoyed an easy lead because big ships could benefit from centuries of lessons learnt at sea, while the airplane was really breaking new ground. The 1930s saw some truly revolutionary aircraft begin to turn the tide though. The Boeing 314 Clipper, a flying boat aptly named after the great fast-sailing clipper ships of old, did something once thought only as science fiction when it carried passengers and mail across the Atlantic in 1939. Only a dozen were ever built, and the route took nearly 30 hours with multiple refueling stops, but for the 40 or so passengers it was the quickest way yet to cross the Atlantic. This was the sign of things to come, but then the world erupted into a global conflict and the transatlantic passenger service, both above and on the water, was rudely halted for 6 years. This was the crucial moment the airplane had needed to get ahead, because while the construction and development of ocean liners had virtually stopped overnight in late 1939, the development of aircraft engines and technology was absolutely paramount. Many things came out of the Second World War that changed the airplane and travel forever. The first was the jet engine. The development of fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt 262, the Gloucester Meteor and the Lockheed P-80 proved the jet engine as a supremely powerful propulsion system, something that could propel aircraft up to incredible speeds. But arguably the most important development, for passenger comfort especially, was cabin pressurization. In 1940, the Boeing Stratoliner had introduced the system that enabled passengers to breathe and live comfortably at much higher altitudes. The system was perfected in the B-29 bomber. Now the airplane could fly incredibly high up, over the bad weather which had once tormented it. 1952 would prove to be a critical year for the ocean liner. It had benefited from wartime lessons too, and the SS United States was designed and built in the post-war world with technology that had been seen on modern American battleships. Superheated boilers and advanced propeller designs saw the new ship snatch the speed record from the old Queen Mary in July that year and bring the transatlantic crossing down to just 3 days and 10 hours, an incredible feat. This was the fastest an ocean liner had ever been, but it was also the fastest an ocean liner would ever be. Because although the United States designers didn't know it yet, even as they were preparing their ship for its triumphant maiden voyage, another vessel's first trip was underway, but this one was above the clouds. Introduced as the world's first commercial jet airliner by Britain's BOAC, the de Havilland Comet shook the world's merchant marines to their core. While its predecessors had been sluggish, cold, and uncomfortable, the Comet promised a new era in air travel with its quiet, pressurized cabin, expanded passenger capacity, and unprecedented fuel efficiency, range, and speed, all thanks to its advanced jet engines. What was once a nightmarish mode of travel now seemed positively cushy by comparison, and that's to say nothing of that speed. Suddenly, a crossing which once took days could now feasibly be undertaken in just hours. Ship owners were initially nervous, but they may have been somewhat heartened by a series of crashes which shook public confidence in the Comet. By the mid-50s, though, the kinks had been ironed out of the Comet and the playing field had been levelled. It was a showdown. Ocean liners against airliners. At first, Cunard and the great shipping lines thought they could weather the storm. Passenger numbers stayed steady in the early and mid-1950s and things looked good. But then, as the decade wore on, something changed. The series of Comet hull losses in the early 1950s, two of them fatal, had forced the company back to the drawing board to address severe issues with the pressurization of its cabins. These overhauls in the design of the aircraft would ultimately result in the Comet 4, in which designers applied all the lessons they had learned from their early efforts to create something that would go on to revolutionize the world of aviation. On October 4th, 1958, the Comet 4 became the first jet airliner to complete a commercial transatlantic flight. Not just one, but two aircraft undertaking the journey simultaneously, one bound for New York and the other for London. The westbound plane touched down after just over 10 hours, including a single brief stop in Gander, Newfoundland to refuel. The eastbound flight completed its journey in just 6 hours. The new jetliners were proving to be to the ocean liner what the ocean liner had once been to the sailing ship. Even if it seemed a losing battle, it was still a battle. The great passenger lines tried to stem the falling passenger fares. Cunard especially, with a dozen liners still in service, hoped to sway customers away from this new and speedy mode of transport, with one director quoted as saying, "Flying is a fad, it will pass." Cunard was still operating two of the world's most popular passenger ships, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, with 10 other ships accompanying them in the fleet. But they were hard-pressed to convince the public to opt for a 6-day crossing when a 9-hour flight was now entirely within reach. In October 1958, passenger numbers for airlines eclipsed those of shipping lines for the first time, with 1.5 million travellers crossing by air versus a comparatively pitiful 882,000 by sea. It was just a sign of things to come, because that same year, 1958, delivered a death blow to the ocean liner with the introduction of a real world beater, an aircraft that would bring air travel to the masses. The year prior, it had taken its first flight just south of Seattle, Washington. It was the Boeing 707. This was the aircraft which would define the jet age, with a 600-mile-an-hour service speed, capacity for 181 passengers, compared to the Comet's 70 or so, and an overall safer service record. The Boeing 707 completed its own crossing from New York to Paris on October 26, 1958, and a total of 8 hours and 40 minutes, including the refueling stop in Gander. It would have taken a liner days to cover the same distance. There could be no more denying it. The jet age was well and truly here. This was truly a nightmare scenario for the world's ocean liners and the companies that owned them. Almost overnight, what had once been considered the foremost option for travel was now functionally dead. Nowhere was this more evident than the once glittering New York Chelsea piers. By 1960, the once lively piers were already beginning to fall into disrepair, and where they had at one time been the home to the hustle and bustle of merry travellers and the luxurious liners they sailed on, now the piers were mainly relegated to handling cargo ships. But even this era was short-lived, and the last of the cargo ships had left the piers by 1967. It was a sorry sight. The piers fell into disrepair, and abandonment, an ugly stain on the Hudson River front. Airports had taken their place, becoming the epicenter of the bustling travel world. Dramatically impacted by this shift was the United States line, who throughout the 1950s had enjoyed nearly unprecedented success with their record-breaking superliner, the SS United States. The United States was the largest ocean liner ever built by the Americans, and the fastest liner ever too. But even she was no match for the Boeing 707, which was capable of cracking the equivalent of a staggering 521 knots to her 38. It was a fight that the shipping world was sure to lose. While a running mate for the SS United States had been planned, Congress could no longer justify putting millions of dollars behind what was, by all accounts, a dying industry. Funding was withheld and the SS United States successor would never materialise. In 1961, the United States had to cancel a crossing because only 350 passengers had booked. A series of strikes in 1965 saw all of the ship's summer voyages cancelled. She was permanently pulled from service just 4 years later. The SS United States had been a technological triumph, but she only saw service for 17 years, and even then, nearly 8 of those had been a struggle just for survival. While the rest of the shipping world could do little more than balk at the disastrous cards they'd been dealt, the ever-industrious Cunard Line decided to operate under the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. In fact, a few decades prior to the aviation boom, Cunard experimented with the world of air travel. This was still well before the dawn of the jet airliner back in 1937. Sir Percy Bates, then chairman of the company, was approached by Imperial Airways, who came in with a very tempting pitch. They offered Cunard a partnership and a venture into the world of flying boats, not unlike the Boeing Clipper, to supplement their fleet of liners. Bates had his doubts. Put simply, with the world still relying heavily on sea travel, and the Great Depression putting a damper on much of the travel industry's innovation, he failed to see what the company could stand to gain by expanding from sea to air. But nearly 10 years later, in 1946, Bates' successor, Sir John Brocklebank, seemed to be a more forward-thinking sort, and he was willing to revisit the idea. Brocklebank's plan included an in-house airline to add to the company's fleet, bolstering their position in the ever-changing travel world. In 1960, with airlines now exerting their dominance more and more, Cunard inked a deal with Eagle Airways to purchase a 60% share in their company. This £30 million investment would lead to the introduction of Cunard Eagle Airways, and with the acquisition, the company hoped to cement themselves as a lasting presence in the travel industry despite declining numbers in their ocean-going fleet. It seemed a natural response for the company in the face of dwindling ocean travel, and the very next year, in 1961, Cunard Eagle was operating daily transatlantic flights to accompany its continuing transoceanic schedule. This seemed to do the trick, and eventually Cunard Eagle was operating flights to destinations all around the world. In 1962, the venture caught the attention of BOAC, who in turn offered Cunard a 30% stake in their own company. Cunard Eagle became BOAC Cunard. Eagle Airways pulled out of their side of the agreement a year later, but with tidy profits in 1964, BOAC and Cunard both held on with high hopes for a successful partnership in the long run. The unfortunate truth was that while partner BOAC had both feet firmly in the aviation business, Cunard was still operating a fleet of ships, and a pricey one at that. Meanwhile, aircraft were still evolving, and with the powerful Boeing 747 on the horizon, the company knew they lacked the capital to continue to finance both seagoing and airborne vessels, each becoming pricier with every new iteration. By the late 1960s, despite decades of attempts to position themselves as a travel juggernaut on both sea and air, reality had finally set in, and the overextended Cunard admitted defeat. BOAC Cunard officially dissolved in 1966. This was the last time a passenger shipping company would seriously attempt to toy with the world of commercial aviation. Cunard's chairman at the time, Basil Smallpiece, underlined the company's position by saying Cunard is a shipping company, and it will prosper in the long term by making its shipping operations profitable. It seemed the move was ultimately the right one. The company returned to its roots and reinvested the capital earned by the sale of its stake in BOAC, using the profits to begin the construction of a large, luxurious passenger vessel that would symbolise the next generation of Cunard's fleet, the Queen Elizabeth II. Even with the Oceanliner dying out, QE2, as she would one day be affectionately nicknamed, was designed to maintain a liner's transatlantic service, but she could also run cruises thanks to her clever layout. She was a new ship for a new era. If passenger ship companies were to survive at all, they would have to look to the growing leisure cruise market instead. Other shipping lines found their own ways to try to stay afloat in the face of airborne adversity. Travel on the Atlantic was not the only business impacted by the widespread introduction of jetliners, and in 1960 P&O Lines shored up their own defences against the burgeoning air travel threat by merging with their old rivals Orient to create P&O Orient. This move allowed the company to drastically increase its footprint in the Pacific, culminating in a service that spanned 44 countries across a staggering 366 ships. This made P&O Orient the largest ocean-going passenger fleet in the world, and they'd continued to see a surprising amount of success. One factor that helped them defy the odds was the Australian immigration boom starting in 1945. These were the years of the £10 POM scheme, as it was known, the post-war push by the Australian government to urge British citizens to migrate to Australia for the low rate of just £10. Many of these immigrants made their voyages on one of the P&O Orient fleet, my own family among them in 1959, and by the time the initiative wrapped up in 1972, over 1 million people had immigrated to Australia through the program. It served to bolster Australia's population numbers and P&O's traffic, and led the company to make a crucial addition to their fleet. While it may have made sense to play it safe in the face of the bleak outlook, P&O instead decided to up the ante, and in 1961 they introduced their newest liner, the SS Canberra, which upon her completion clocked in at 45,733 gross registered tons, making her the largest liner yet built for any route outside of the transatlantic service. It was clear that P&O intended to keep both feet firmly in the shipping business and fight fire with fire, and for the most part, it paid off for them, even in the face of languishing worldwide passenger numbers. But all of these efforts combined were still a lifeline at best, and even the largest fleet in the world was not immune to the overwhelming shifts brought on by air travel. With the £10 POM scheme at its end and passenger numbers continuing to nosedive, by the mid-70s P&O had scrapped virtually all of its great pre- and post-war liners and moved away to cargo and cruises instead. Interestingly, while many companies were desperately trying to expand away from shipping to stay alive, some clever business owners were doing just the opposite, and they were finding success. Chandris Lines was founded in 1960, just 2 years after the Comet's first successful commercial transatlantic flight. Much like P&O, the aim of the Chandris line was to capitalise on the still profitable immigration trade to Australia. Their MO was simple: buy retired ocean liners at minimum cost and work them hard for maximum profit. They did this well, and their ships Australis, Ellinis, Britannis, and Patris became well-known migrant vessels carrying thousands for new lives down under. The 3-week voyage was far from luxurious, and the ships had definitely seen better days. But the business strategy worked, and even as aircraft dominated many major routes, Chandris Line's ships sailed well booked with passengers even into the late 1970s. It was the late 60s that saw the real end of the era of the Oceanliner. Cunard's trusty flagship, the RMS Queen Mary, and her running mate, Queen Elizabeth, still operated on their usual transatlantic run well into the 60s, but as you'd expect, demand was dwindling. Oftentimes, the ships would reach port with fewer passengers aboard than crew. By 1965, the transatlantic service, which once had been the company's bread and butter, was no longer profitable, and the entire fleet was operating at a loss. Both queens were sold off, the Mary to the port of Long Beach, and the Elizabeth to a Hong Kong-based businessman who hoped to convert her into a floating university. The retirement of the queens heralded the real end of an era. The Oceanliner had finally died. But adaptable companies like P&O, Chandris, and even Cunard began to sense a new opportunity to keep some of their fleet in service. Cruising was actually nothing new at the time. In fact, the world's first purpose-built cruise ship had been the Hamburg America Line's Princess and Victoria Louise all the way back in 1900. The 1960s, though, had seen a huge uptick in demand for leisure cruises, even as demand for travel by air was reaching new heights, and cruising offered an experience that airlines couldn't hope to match. A leisurely holiday at sea where one could while away the hours with any number of activities offered on board, all with the freedom to move around the vessel, instead of being restricted to one single seat in the cabin of an aircraft. While airlines offered an efficient mode of travel, cruisers offered an actual enjoyable experience, and it was this very experience that kept the world's ships at sea, even in the face of an industry which threatened to make them obsolete. Many of the remaining great ocean liners found new lives as cruise ships. Probably the most successful was the SS France. She'd been built too late to capitalise on the golden age of the ocean liner. A triumph for her home nation though she was, France was introduced just a few years after the first commercial flight of the de Havilland Comet. She saw only 14 years of service with French Line, and that should have been the end. Except a new and budding cruise line had other plans for her. Norwegian Cruise Line picked France up and transformed her into the SS Norway. What had begun life as a transatlantic passenger liner, designed to operate a schedule as ruthlessly and efficiently as a train, ended her days as a beloved cruise ship running pleasure voyages around the world. The transition to cruising wasn't easy on all ocean liners, and some just couldn't cut it. The Italian liners Cristoforo Colombo and Leonardo da Vinci were just too expensive to run. They'd been built to absolutely burn through monstrous amounts of fuel to run at breakneck transatlantic speeds, not swanning around on joy cruises. Not only that, but their class-segregated interiors became a confusing maze once the ship was converted to one-class cruising, with staircases that skipped decks and corridors that seemed to go nowhere. By contrast, other ships had been designed with this future in mind. The Dutch SS Rotterdam used a genius system of folding panels that could separate classes during a crossing, or be folded down to open the ship up for one-class cruising. She had a long and successful career with her original owners and beyond into the 21st century. The first half of the 20th century saw the ocean liner at its absolute peak. The world was connected like never before, and passengers could be carried across entire oceans in record times and in unmatched comfort. Countries took pride in producing the biggest and the best vessels the world had ever seen, consistently outclassing one another in terms of size, speed, strength, luxury, and efficiency. But as history has shown us time and time again, technology is constantly finding new ways to change and evolve, so it was little wonder that the ocean liner's days were numbered. Looking back at the success of the SS United States and the blue ribbon holders who came before her, one fundamental truth rings clear. In the eyes of a fickle travelling public, speed comes above everything else. It seems obvious then that for all its wonders, this stately and beautiful mode of travel was bound to be eclipsed by the miracle of flight, and by 1958 that was exactly what had happened. Despite the best efforts of the most illustrious shipping lines of the time, travellers were largely ready to move on from the ocean liner and on to the next big thing. They simply voted with their wallets. The results were disastrous for an entire industry and way of life. The Chelsea piers, once the glorious site of Ocean Liner Row, fell into disrepair in the 60s, rotted in the 70s, and then completely collapsed in the 80s before they were fully dismantled. Today, the waterfront has been rejuvenated with parks, bars, and luxury hotels, and only the facade of Cunard's Pier 54 remains of the massive original structure. At the other end of the route, in Southampton, the magnificent custom-built Ocean Terminal building, designed specifically for the big mail ships like Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, had worked as a kind of lounge and baggage handling facility with a massive train station so passengers could easily step foot from off of their train and onto their ship. It was finished in the 50s, but scrapped in the 80s, already a relic of a bygone era. But within a decade, the cruise industry had exploded, and Southampton once again found itself needing exactly the kind of ocean terminal building it had demolished. Today, if you want to board a cruise ship from the port, you won't do so from a beautiful deco building, but from a series of Spartan sheds instead. Such is the march of progress. Of the ocean-going greats that had once won the hearts of millions, few remain today. The Queen Mary has been preserved as a museum and a hotel in Long Beach, California, but Queen Elizabeth caught fire and burnt to a crisp in the 60s before her university overhaul ever bore any fruit. The Rotterdam has been remarkably well restored and now acts as a museum and a hotel in the port of her name in the Netherlands. France served for years as the cruise ship Norway, the sweetheart of tens of thousands of passengers, before being finally scrapped in 2006. United States, the brilliant record-breaking speed demon, has sat rotting for years at a dock in Philadelphia, and now, instead of being preserved for future generations, it looks like she's going to be sunk to become an artificial reef. There is just one glorious ship at sea upholding the old traditions, Cunard's Queen Mary II, a remarkable, special ship built in the early 2000s. She was designed to fulfill the role her forebears had done so well before her. With 40% more steel than your standard cruise ship at much greater construction expense, The Queen Mary 2 can take the worst the Atlantic can throw at her. Once, recently, in a terrific storm, most Atlantic traffic was stopped in its tracks, including ships of the Navy, who were bemused to spot, on their radar screens, one vessel making good headway into the huge seas. "What are you?" they radioed out. The reply was simple and concise. "The Queen Mary," they said.